This week on Inside Olympia, a newspaper man turned state historian. John Hughes reflects on two careers as he prepares to retire. First, bringing the news to people in Grays Harbor and beyond, and for the last 17 as the state's chief historian. Hughes joins us for the full hour for an exit interview.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia and our last interview before our summer hiatus. This week, we dive deep into the career of a newspaperman turned state historian, a career that spanned nearly 6 decades. My guest was editor and publisher of the Aberdeen Daily World, covering hot-button issues like spotted owl protection and its impact on logging and rural economies. He also weathered upheaval in the news business as newspapers faced a fiscal cliff. For the last 17 years, he has told the stories of Washington politicians and luminaries as chief historian of the Legacy Washington Project, a position under the Secretary of State's office. In that role, he produced 17 books and numerous exhibits, and now he is retiring. Joining me now, and for the full hour this week for an exit interview, is the state's chief historian, John Hughes.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
This is
no pressure.
No pressure. This is momentous, though, because it is the end of a almost 6-decade career, a long stint with the Legacy Washington Project, during which you produced. I mean, you were, if I do my math right, you were doing a book a year.
Just about.
Yeah. So prolific, but I want to go way back in time because I think that to understand your role as the state's historian and bringing to life these stories, we need to understand your story. So let's reel the tape back.
Okay.
And I think of you in our first interactions was in the context of you being the publisher of the newspaper in Aberdeen. But that's not where you started. You started out growing up in the harbor.
I did.
So take us back.
It's a fascinating place to grow up. It's gritty old Grays Harbor. Timber economy, cyclical. When I was a kid growing up, Aberdeen and Hoquiam together were certainly a lot bigger place and a lot more happening place than Olympia. Whenever Aberdeen High School played Olympia, it always felt sort of like this was a backwater, apart from some good hamburger stands. But it was a fascinating thing to grow up in. My two uncles were business agents and later key leaders of the International Woodworkers of America, a classic CIO in 1930s union that was steeped in all the conflict between the red elements, if you will, including some of the best organizers in the International Woodworkers of America were communists. That was often the case in the wake of the New Deal's reforms for unionizing, and my uncles were more centrist conservatives. So I had a front row seat for a lot of that. Briefly worked in a lumber mill. That's if you briefly spend a summer working at a lumber mill, it convinces you that there would be other occupations. That's for sure. So I was one of those kids who grew up just steeped in history because I'd heard all the stories about the 30s and the 40s on Grays Harbor. Unsolved murders, the Wobblies. It was just, it was a funny story that when I arrived at the University of Puget Sound in 1962, Murray Morgan, the Dean of Northwest Historians and the author of Skid Row, still the best book in my view ever written about Seattle, just a brilliant historian. He was on loan for a quarter, maybe a semester, to teach a Northwest history class at the behest of my English professor, or another really great guy named Harold Peter Simonson, who later went on to the University of Washington. Well, Professor Simonson knew that I was from Aberdeen and that Murray had been a newspaper man in Hoquiam on the Morning Washingtonian in the 1930s for one stint and then in the 1940s. So he'd apparently told Murray, you got to meet this kid. And after class, Professor Morgan said to me, kid, there's one thing I want to know. Are there still any operating whorehouses in Aberdeen, Washington? And I said, well, I don't have it on firsthand experience, but I know that I'm now at McChord Air Force Base in the Air Force on an Air Force scholarship to this fine institution, and I have to get a special dispensation to come home every weekend because Grace Harbor is still off limits from its
Is that right?
body days.
Interesting.
Anyway, so then Murray took me to the Poodle Dog Cafe in Fife, and we drank coffee and talked about Grace Harbor and about unsolved murders. And he said to me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a history major, so I think I'd like to teach." And he said, I'll never forget these words and how emphatic he was. He said, "You should be a newspaper man first. You'll really learn firsthand what it means to write quickly, and you'll meet some most inimitable characters." And he was certainly right, because when I got out of the Air Force, almost with a college degree, 120 semester hours, and was that was January 6, 1966, and I talked to my advisor at UPS and said, "What does it take to finish my bachelor's degree?" And we got that all plotted out. And the next day I walked into the newsroom at the Aberdeen Daily World. They offered me a job, and I never looked back for the next 42 years. So,
why did you go back? You left to go to college in Tacoma. Why did you go back?
Grace Harbor is one of those places that that has terroir, a sense of place. There's something about it. Now, the heartbreaking thing about Grace Harbor in the wake of what's happened with the spotted owl set-asides and all that is it's instituted generational poverty, so the place isn't the same. I stay there because I have a nice house not far from Bowerman Basin in Hoquiam that I could never afford up here. Still have a lot of friends, and it's just something in my blood. It's where I think I belong.
Well, and I also want to ask you why you stayed, because a lot of times in the newspaper business, you move, you start out in a town like Aberdeen, but then you work your way up, and you certainly mentored many journalists who did that. But what was it about the harbor that held on to you and that you decided to rise through the ranks of that particular newspaper and sort of serving a community in rural America rather than saying, I got to get to the Washington Post or the New York Times or even the Seattle Times?
The Times was the one that really held any allure for me.
Which one? The Seattle?
The Seattle Times, with the Blethens and the reputation that started in the 1950s with their first Pulitzer Prize. And so there were offers, in fact, several offers. And for one reason or another, then we started having kids. And then I kept moving up. And I always thought, boy, I got to be city editor and then managing editor and then executive editor. And it was so much fun to be. Jim King, the editor of the Seattle Times, is this wonderful avuncular guy. Everyone at the Times loved him. If you called Central Casting, they'd roll in a Jim King on casters. That's the kind of guy he was. And when I got to be editor, Jim loved to clam dig, so he would stop in my office before or after clam digging and just sit around and smoke his pipe and watch people come and go, actually being able to walk into a newsroom, into a newspaper without security, to drop off a letter to the editor, to tell a story. And he said, this is wonderful. He said, I'm sort of this hermetically sealed Bauhaus kind of place at Fairview and John, and it's a great newspaper, but it's not like this. Adele Ferguson and I were talking about the same thing, why she remained at the Bremerton Sun for all those years.
Longtime columnist.
So
withering observer of what happened in politics.
Withering,
right?
What a wonderful line, Austin. Sid Snyder used to say that when the Bremerton Sun arrived in the newsstands, racked here in Olympia during legislative sessions, there was a mad rush by the legislators to see what Adele had written about them, and both in her column and the reportage.
Well, I want to sort of scene set a little bit, and we will, of course, get to your career at the Secretary of State's office and with Legacy Washington, but I want to set the scene for what it was like to be running a newspaper like the Daily World in Aberdeen at the peak when the newspaper business was still thriving, and maybe the economy of Grace Harbor was. You had at one time 21 reporters.
I did.
It was a big, busy newsroom.
Yeah.
And you were covering coastal Washington, a broader
Absolutely.
region. What were those days like when the money was coming in, when you could hire people,
was
when you could go out and
fabulous.
do good journalism?
It was fabulous. The small daily newspapers like Aberdeen and Wenatchee in particular, always my ideal with the Woodses, what they'd done there, Wilfred.
And by the way, you wrote a book about this as well.
I did, and
Yes.
that's modestly, that's a really good book. I set out to do a book about the Wenatchee World, the Seattle Times, and the Spokesman Review. Spokesman Review people balked for, I don't know what the reasons were.
That's the Coles family?
Yeah, I didn't have the access I wanted to do that, so it was about the Blethens and the Woodses, and it still turned out great. But the best journalism schools in the Northwest, UW, WSU, the Murrow School, Western had a terrific program. Cliff Rao, who did a lot of great commentary for KPLU, and some TVW had been the city editor at the Seattle Times and the Chicago Tribune, and was producing really high quality graduates out of PLU. So everyone had to start someplace. We paid decently, but not great. So if you were at Astoria or Aberdeen or Longview or the Olympian, you got blue chip people. And I think that we got more than our share of blue chip people because I always wanted a newsroom where we encouraged investigative reporting. We did some tough stories. John Dodge, who worked for me for 10 years and then went back to the Olympian, being an Olympia kid, should have won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of Whoops. If not John, Joel Conley that same year for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. One of those guys should have won.
And this was the failed nuclear
absolutely,
project.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the John and Joel were just all over that story. They did brilliant work.
But you weren't ceding that to the big city papers.
No way. No way.
And you had the staff and you had the
we
reporting
did.
chops
and
the
great
editing
photographers
chops to do it.
too. Three at one time. Three great photographers on staff.
So just to flash forward to help us understand the state of the business today, how many reporters are at that paper?
3.
And the peak was 21.
Yep. And the circulation when I left was just below 18,000. In the last, I think I saw from the obligatory publisher's statement required by the post office, I think it was under 5,000.
You've said, I mean, retirement should be a point of celebration, but you've said you're a little melancholy these days. One of the reasons why is because of the state of journalism.
It's more than a little. The state of journalism, the closure, at least to the public, of the Washington State Library and the Washington Talking Book and Braille
Which is
Library.
happening as we speak because of state cutbacks.
I
and
can't think
mass
of
layoffs.
anything more gratuitously stupid than to close a great cultural institution like the Washington State Library. Together with my teammates over the past 17 years, there's no way we could have done this work without the great librarians at the Washington State Library.
You took me when I went to visit you in your office. You took me through the library to
incredible.
sort of show me this is where I go to do my work.
All of the microfilm, every newspaper in the state since before statehood, troves of material, clippings, scrapbooks, electronic resources, maps, ephemera.
What's going to happen to this?
I have no idea. But
Will there be somebody left?
well,
behind?
there's a skeleton crew left, and I'm sure they're trying. I know they're trying to figure out what to do with a skeleton crew, with the hope that there'll be some resuscitation. What's particularly galling is the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. What an incredible resource for people who've lost their sight. Imagine this. Again, how gratuitous is it to close a library like that brings such pleasure and knowledge to people who've lost their sight. Early on, after I finished the biography of Booth Gardner, I was at Watauble and met the fellow who was narrating the Booth Gardner book, and he said to me, he says, "Oh, this is wonderful. This is the first one of these that we've done." And then later I got letters and notes from people who'd lost their sight who told me how meaningful that was to them. It's just a travesty, Austin.
You're talking about the state institutions, but a similar story can be told about newspapers.
Well, the really shocking thing is that the reason that I came to the Secretary of State's office in 2008 was because on one fateful Friday, the day when the numbers came out in the newspaper business, how you'd done that past week vis-a-vis revenues, I got a call from the regional vice president of the media group that owned the Daily World, a really good guy, by the way, who said, boy, John, there's good news and there's bad news. And I said, well, give me the bad first. I'll take the bad first. He says, well, your profits have slipped below 20%. And I was just sort of, I saw that it was 1908 or 1907, whatever, and I thought to myself, an automobile dealer or supermarket owner would fairly swoon over the notion of 19.7% profits. And I said, so what's the good news? And he said, the good news, we love you. You are a great publisher, you're doing a great job, and we know that you'll weather this and you'll get it back up and to 20%, which is no longer a problem property. Love that, a problem property. And he said, so for starters, we need to cut another 100,000. I said, I can't do that. He said, well, that was not a request, that's an order. And so I thought, well, I need some time to think about that. As I recall, several days passed, and I got a call from David Ammons, one of my oldest and dearest friends, who a year or several months earlier had jumped ship from being the best AP reporter in the history of Olympia to be Sam Reed's
Communications
director and chief policy advisor.
At the Secretary of State's office.
Yes. And Dave said, Sam would like to talk to you. We've got a job that we think has your name written all over it. And I said, what, pray tell, would that be? And he told me this story that Sam and Sam Hunt, state representative then, future state senator, I hope I have that right,
yeah, sounds right.
Came up with a notion that the Secretary of State had overseen legislative oral histories. But Sam Reed said, well, there's, with all due respect to old legislators, they're former members of the executive branch, the judiciary, Congress. And then this wonderful phrase that Sam authored, I'm certain, said, and other people from all walks of life who have made an indelible contribution to the political history of Washington State. Wow, what a great idea. So,
and let's just go back to sort of make a note of that, the indelible impact.
Yeah.
And suddenly that widens.
For a storyteller,
right?
For a reporter,
the aperture gets bigger.
For a guy who Murray said it's the sport of kings and think bigger. I mean, you're a reporter or you're a historian.
So you're faced with, you can stay in your job as the newspaper publisher and start firing people, laying them off, or maybe start Act Two.
Act Two, and cut my pay from $150,000 with a bonus, potential bonus, if I cut.
If you could get that 20%.
If I could get that 20%
right,
back
plus,
up to,
stop being a problem child.
I think 80,000 was what I started out, or maybe less than that, 75,000.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so you did take. What did your wife say about that?
She was not happy.
Yeah.
She wanted me to be happy, but she was not happy.
Yeah.
And the kids, one was finishing up at Swarthmore, the other at Gonzaga.
Yeah, so you had some tuition to pay.
Yeah, we did.
But what's the lesson in that?
Well, after we weathered the storm, and then timing could have been great. 2008.
Oh yeah.
As soon as I got there, we were fighting for our lives
for the budget. Sure.
Against. Then we were. I was also concurrently a trustee of the Washington State Historical Society, thanks to Chris Gregoire, which has been one of the enduring, wonderful things in my career. It's such a Jennifer Sanders, Kilmer Sanders, has just done such a wonderful job, and Dave Nicandri before her, so that's a real treat. But so Sam was as good as his word, and I had carte blanche. And for starters, I did our bestseller ever. I spent a couple of days at Deep River with Chris Novoselic of Nirvana fame, who'd just written a book called Of Grunge and Government. And he was all
he's a bit of a government nerd.
Yeah, he is. It was ranked
grunging.
Choice voting, you name it, and a Renaissance man. And one of my favorite people, because I'd known Kurt and Chris when they were sort of upstairs from Chris' mom's hair salon around the corner from the newspaper. And earlier when Chris was working the counter at the Aberdeen Taco Bell. So that was a great interview. Had a great experience a couple of years ago. My interview with Chris got quoted in the New Yorker magazine. And since I've been a fan of the New Yorker since I was 16, that was a real thrill.
I hope you cut that out.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Well, so you were just talking about the library and this idea that history exists on microfiche. It exists in libraries, but you were credited with coming in and kind of breathing life into boxes of archival records, telling stories that would have remained out of reach or untold. Somebody told us that your Dan Evans project, and by the way, we have that book on the desk here, right in front of you.
We do have that book right here. This ought to be jumping off the shelves right now.
So it's his autobiography, but you stepped in. Is that right?
Joel Connolly, bless his heart, said that if he outlived me, that he could write my obituary, he would say something like, John Hughes, a versatile newspaperman and historian who spent more than 50 years telling the stories of Washingtonians, nevertheless should go down in history for having gotten Daniel J. Evans's autobiography finally in print.
Because Dan had been working on this for a long time.
He had been working on it. I talked to Dan Evans about this before he left.
So was there a moment where you said to him, look, Governor, we got to get this across the finish line, and I'm going to help you do it?
Well, bless her heart, Nancy Evans. I had written Nancy Evans's biography, oral history biography with the Secretary of State. And surely you've interviewed Nancy Evans.
I don't know that I have, actually.
She is just this amazing woman. She is just a force of nature. Talk about overworked phrases, but she was. And she...
By the way, we do have an image here of you with Secretary Reed and Nancy Evans, which we'll show. And this would have been, what year would that have been, do you think?
Gosh.
You don't look a day older
No,
though, John.
I haven't aged a whit. So this is probably 2015, maybe.
Okay.
And anyway, so after we finished Nancy, and Dan would be popping in from time to time, listening to these interviews. And I got to visit his study, and he had a lot of books and a lot of ephemera, and so we were sort of putzing around. The really cool thing about getting to do Nancy's biography was that early on, as a young reporter, I had tremendous entree to the Evans administration because Jim Dolliver was a great outdoorsman, future Chief Justice of the Washington Supreme Court, Chief of Staff to Governor Evans, and he used to come into the Aberdeen world clam digging or whatever he was doing. And he was just this, I used the phrase earlier, I should have saved it for Jim, a real Renaissance man, together with Bill Dwyer, that caliber of person. So, and then Jay Fredrickson, who was the son of my managing editor, Abe Fredrickson, became Dan's press secretary.
Oh.
So
So you had some entree.
I had real entree to the Evans administration. It was really great. So one day I got a call after finishing Nancy's biography, and it was Dan. He said, we should meet at, the Iron Rabbit in West Olympia. He said, can you come down, can you meet me tomorrow afternoon? We've got something we really need to talk about. So with Nancy in tow, he pulled up and opened the trunk, and he got about 12 white binders full of this autobiography as a work in progress. And he said, choose my words carefully, he had paid some guy to look at this stuff, and that didn't turn out real well. And he said, you should do this, Nancy says, and I agree. And I said, well, I don't know. We usually are doing...
Yeah, you're starting from scratch. You were telling... You're not doing it. You're not in the autobiography business. You're in the biography business.
So I mentioned this to Kim Wyman, bless her heart.
Who was the Secretary of State at the time, the successor to Sam Reed.
And she said, oh, we've got to do that. Yeah. She said, do that. And I said, okay, sounds like fun. Little did I know
what you were getting yourself into.
No, I had no idea.
And it all started with in the parking lot with the trunk open
at the Iron Rabbit.
It sounds.
So I took all this stuff home. I loaded it into my car and took it all home, and there were, I think, 500,000 words.
Wow.
And it was, and the interesting thing was that Daniel Jackson Evans was really a pretty good storyteller, except in the parlance of newspapering, he buried his leads.
Right. And he clearly needed an editor.
Yeah, he really did. So the best thing is, people have asked me, is this really me writing or Dan? And it's 90% Dan. It's 90% Dan and 10% me smoothing some stuff out, cutting, and writing in his voice or boosting up the leads. There was this one really great instance, for example, where he met with a group at the height of black power with these really agitated, angry black kids in the Central District, and Dan was being so avuncular, and this one kid came up to him and made a gun with his hand and pointed at the governor's head and said, you know, for 2 cents plain or whatever, I'd shoot you right now. And Evans, startled, quickly regained his composure and said, what good would that do? And the kid said something like, it's in here, I hope I quote it right, one less honky, you know. And so when I read that, it's way deep in this chapter, and I thought, boy, that's the lead of that. And then the more I talked to him, then he was really, compliance, not the word, but enthusiastic. He said, oh, God, that's a great idea. So you got to fast forward here with Nancy prodding all the while.
Sure.
Nancy Evans's classic chicken salad lunches. We're working on this autobiography, and I'm cutting, and he's putting stuff back in, and I'm cutting. And finally got to the point where it was this wonderful moment where someone who I'd idolized as a landmark 3-term governor, United States senator, college president, outdoorsman, I got to the point where it was no longer governor or senator. I could just say, Dan, you've got to listen to me. And then Nancy came around the corner one day and said, Dan, for God's sakes, listen to John once. And this happened on the last day when this book had to go to the printer. Daniel J. Evans is squinting over the galleys with a red pencil, and he's marking on the corner of each DJE and making little corrections. So I got it out the door.
He was literally redlining.
He was redlining.
But it also sounds like you were in the classic role of ghostwriter, which has been written about.
No, not really. I wouldn't call it ghostwriter at all. There was nothing that I did that amounted to ghostwriting. It was rather...
it was just editing. From your perspective.
And also rewriting.
Yeah.
But it's the first time.
But it is the difference between writing the biography of the person you have researched based on your interviews and having to work with the author of his own autobiography and having to negotiate and navigate that. That's what I'm trying to get at. This was was it the hardest book you've ever written?
Yeah. It was. It was pretty amazing. Right. It was, and I'm really proud of it. It's really good. This book ought to be required reading. The mainstream Republicans of Washington, featuring Sam Reed, my former boss and friend, had their convention in Yakima, or wherever it is, a few weeks back, and they devoted one entire day to celebrating the legacy of Daniel J. Evans. And I thought about going, and then I decided I didn't want to go because I knew that if nobody really read a key entry in this book on the last day, that I would be like the guy who put the mouse in the punch bowl, and I would read it, and that would cause grief for Sam, who's a true mainstreamer. Right. But what I'm talking about is something that Evans said to me as we headed down the stretch. And I said, of course, we're going to need to talk about Donald J. Trump. And he said, of course. And so when I came back a week later, he had written a chapter called Dan Evans Republicans. And he wrote, friends and foes, together with pundits and historians, have been trying to label me for 65 years. I'm annoyed that liberal Democrats have hijacked progressive. Granted, former Vice President Henry Wallace was out in left field under that banner in 1948, but Teddy Roosevelt, one of his heroes, was the genuine article. A half century ago, when I banished the John Birch Society, avoided Barry Goldwater, and admitted to being passionately moderate, Some of my supporters began declaring they were Dan Evans Republicans. There are still even a few who whisper, I am a Dan Evans Democrat. That is simultaneously flattering and divisive. I'm tired of hyphenated republicanism. Moderate, centrist, conservative, even mainstream are adjectives that divide us. And then he went on to say, today, Republicans who value the rule of law and revere the truth are locked in a struggle with Donald Trump Republicans, air quotes. That's a misnomer if there ever was one. Donald J. Trump is not a Republican. He's a populist, arguably the most extraordinary populist in American history. Huey Long was a piker compared to Trump, who against all odds got himself elected President of the United States. Then he proceeded to create a cult of personality based on our darkest fears and deepest resentments, fueled by bizarre conspiracy theories and bald-faced lies, notably the notion that the 2020 election was stolen from him. During Watergate, 60 Minutes commentator Nicholas von Hoffen compared the Nixon presidency to a dead mouse on the American family kitchen floor. My hope is that by 2024, Donald J. Trump will be like last week's dead fish in the garbage pail. I don't think they read that at the mainstream Republican convention.
Maybe not. And what would Dan Evans say today?
I think he'd be heartsick. Slade Gorton on his deathbed in 2020 before the election is a priest. Slade was a observant Episcopalian. I'm told that his rector came to see him routinely as he was dying of complications from Parkinson's. And on one of the last days, the rector said, Senator, what should we talk about now? And Gorton said, we should pray for my country. It's a really sobering thought. It's one of the reasons I'm so melancholy about this. My daughters are talking me off a ledge every day when I see what's happening to American democracy. Here's a piece, a great time.
Well, John, before you start reading, I do have to take a break, so we're going to come
great.
back on that note.
Great.
When we return, we'll continue our exit interview with Legacy Washington chief historian John Hughes, who is stepping down, retiring after a very long career, back right after this.
There's been losses every year since the early 1920s. The shoreline itself was almost 2 miles further out there. Year after year, more homes would fall in the water. We have nothing to lose.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is John Hughes, chief historian of the Legacy Washington Project, who is preparing to retire after a nearly 6-decade-long career in journalism, and for the last 17 as the state's chief chronicler of historically important people and events in this state. So you were just talking about these institutions of Republican politics in this state, and their lament over the direction of the party, the MAGA movement. And yet I want to bring that back, though, to Grays Harbor and the fact that that is a county that for decades voted Democratic and just in the last 2 election cycles flipped red. And so as somebody who has studied and been a part of that community and region of the state for so long, there must be a part of you that has insight, though, into why the Republican Party left the Dan Evans and Slade Gordons behind and turned into the party of Donald Trump.
I am in no way surprised that for the last 3 cycles, Grays Harbor County, once one of the most Democratic counties in America since the coming of the New Deal, has voted for Donald J. Trump. The reason the formerly rock-solid Democratic county of Grays Harbor, together with Cowlitz County, Mason, and some other notable lunch bucket counties, has voted for Trump, has a lot to do with what I view, and I should really have said earlier that a disclaimer, because this is really important to me. I am in no way a spokesman for the Office of Secretary of State. My views may not necessarily be those of the Secretary of State or anyone I've worked with. I'm a historian, and it's a testimony to those Secretaries of State with whom I've worked that I have not been second-guessed about telling the truth about history.
And there hasn't been a partisan litmus test.
Not Not once.
Yeah.
Okay. So Grace Harbor County has voted 3 times for Donald J. Trump. Curiously, last time slightly less so than in 2020 because of a strong sense of betrayal by by Harborites, lunch bucket Harborites perceived that left-leaning Democrats, Seattle Democrats, if you will, have abandoned them during the Spotted Owl set-asides. I often like to observe that during the Boeing bust of the 1970s, labor unions on Grace Harbor, which were then Legion, sent truckloads of foodstuffs and donations to striking Boeing workers and other out of work. And when the Spotted Owl set-asides hit, and Clinton promised that he keep hope alive, that there would be meaningful recovery funds for people who were caught in dramatic cutbacks in logging. That never came true. And the centrist Democrats who had represented Grace Harbor, the likes of Jim Hargrove and Lynn Kessler and Sid Snyder and Brian Blake,
a whole cast of rural, more moderate Democrats.
Moderate Democrats.
A breed of Democrat that's pretty much extinct at this point. Maybe has gone the way of the Spotted Owl.
I couldn't put it better. So those people are now gone, out of office, or sadly deceased. And there's a great new book called The Age of Grievance. And the grievance on Grace Harbor is that the Democratic Party has in essence said, let them eat cake. Sorry, you're collateral damage to the owl. Well, the ironies, of course, is that our friend the Spotted Owl now faces the incursion of the, the barned owl?
Oh, sure.
Yes, and which are horning in, no pun intended, on Spotty's nests and all that. So now the environmentalists, the rock-ribbed environmentalists, are beating their breasts and saying, ain't it awful what the thinning proposals are. So that's what happened. And Danny Westneat, a great columnist for the Times, has often commented to me, said, how could this have happened? Because you've got a higher percentage of people then who are on Obamacare, and now we're waiting to see what happens with a higher percentage of people in Grace Harbor County on Medicaid and what's going to happen there. And
if there are cuts at the federal level.
And imagine this, a flood control project more than a decade in the making to relieve many thousands of Grace Harborites of very expensive flood insurance was immediately trashed by the Trump administration, not to mention NOAA observations for the fishing industry and boating. I mean, the ironies abound, but it's not surprising.
Well, let's go back then to the books you've written and the importance of history for understanding the present. You've written books, as we've established, on Nancy Evans, with Dan Evans, on John Spellman, Slade Gordon, Booth Gardner. Your newest book
Marriage
is
Equality.
Marriage Equality, right? So there were people, but there were also issues that had animated the times. Your newest book, The New Land, chronicles the arrival and resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees in Washington State, which also goes back to the Dan Evans era. Why is it important to tell these stories? Why is it important to publish books about these people who were important figures, certainly in Washington? In some cases, maybe they had a national influence or perch, but most often it was in our state. Why do that?
Because it's important to know about profiles in courage. Because profiles in courage animate us toward citizenship and values, rather than just yelling at one another from our silos and retreating to social media to repeat gossip and half-truths and the like. So if we know the truth about people who stood up and did the right thing, incontrovertibly the right thing, I have really been surprised that John Spellman, practically to his dying breath, regretted the fact that his obituary invariably would say, "our last Republican governor." That was really galling to him. But consider what John Dennis Spellman did in 1982. When the Northern Tier Pipeline Company wanted to carry Alaskan crude from Puget Sound to the Midwest, a $2.7 billion project, a 1,500-mile pipeline, Spellman evaluated that in what he called an epic process of due process. Unemployment in the state was 12%, nearing 20% at Port Angeles, where the issue was pitting neighbor against neighbor. He got all kinds of really heavy pressure from other Republican governors in the Midwest, from the Reagan administration. And finally, what did Spellman do? He said that the record that he reviewed was replete with its failure to support the feasibility of the project. An underwater pipeline capable of carrying nearly a million barrels of oil a day through an area with a history of earthquakes that could liquefy soils in seconds would be a very real threat to Puget Sound, which in my mind is a national treasure. He vetoed that bill.
Wow.
Earlier, what did he do? He cleaned out a rat's nest of political patronage as King County's first elected executive. He mandated that the labor unions stop denying apprenticeships to people of color, and was roundly reviled in a massive protest march in downtown Seattle. I mean, it's an amazing story, and yet he's a one-term governor, and people have forgotten what an amazing legacy that is.
Do you have a favorite book?
I got to write the new book here with my teammate of the past 2 years, a really remarkable historian named Ed Eckley Jr.,
we've
who
met
earlier
Ed.
had worked at the Wing Luke and the Bigelow House. Really glad that Ed will be carrying on with legacy. This book called New Land, about what Washington did 50 years ago to welcome Southeast Asian refugees. When, imagine this. Let's talk about profiles in no courage.
When they were being turned away elsewhere.
Turned away by a former Jesuit seminarian named Jerry Brown, the young, newly inaugurated governor of California, who said that unemployment in his state was too high, that it made no sense to welcome more immigrants, refugees. Others said some patently racist things, but that was Governor Brown's rationale for that. And Evans, one of the people, by the way, who deserves more credit than he's got, and I'm really pleased that it's brought out in this book, is that Secretary of State Bruce Chapman, then our young Secretary of State, a Harvard grad if I recall correctly, was one of the first to really write op-eds and lobby the governor that this was an important issue and that we're all immigrants, one way or other. Then came Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, who just browbeat Congress, a reluctant Congress, to appropriate the funds. And the first governor—
For the resettlements.
For the resettlement, relocation. And Evans was the first governor on that task force and enthusiastically welcomed these people. It's an amazing profile and courage.
And remind me, is the story that he sent, was it Ralph Monroe as his emissary?
Yeah, he sent Ralph to Camp Pendleton to check things out, to see how, what the conditions were like,
Right.
to evaluate if refugees, Southeast Asian refugees who were about to have some climate shock from coming to the Northwest, would they be, to tell them they would be welcome here. Ralph being Ralph, he immediately hopped the first plane and went down there and blew bubbles with kids and charmed refugees, and they sent down a group of people to process the refugees, and now, if I recall the statistic, there's more than 250,000 Cambodian, Lao, and Vietnamese refugees in our state. They made speaking of an indelible contribution to culture and politics in Washington State. It's just a great story. It's a wonderful book.
I'm also struck by the fact that many, if not most of the people you've written about, you were able to interview before they passed away, but have since passed on. And I know another reason you're feeling melancholy is because we are in this era of, in the last year, having lost several of these individuals. Can you reflect a little bit on that?
One of my friends and others have heard me talk about this, but one of the sense of urgency that I've had is that 2004 I was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer.
I don't think I knew that.
My odds were not good, and I'm living proof that high-tech chemotherapy can save lives. So I've felt that's one of the reasons I made the difficult financial decision to join the Office of the Secretary of State in this wonderful new job, was that I felt that a calling to do this. And the melancholy part is that I'm alive and hopefully well, but I count every day as a real blessing, and I get to tell these stories. And Murray was right. It was H.L. Mencken who said that journalism is the sport of kings. You'll never make much money, but when you get to interview the likes of Harry Bridges and presidents of the United States, and it's a pretty remarkable thing. So these people, we've lost a lot of these people, but their stories are alive and well and accessible, free for online. We've sold these books, but our commitment has always been that once we've launched a book and we've sold printed copies, we make the whole transcript PDFs available free online. It's sort of counterproductive for selling books,
Right.
but nevertheless.
That wasn't the goal, though.
No, the goal wasn't.
But the Legacy Washington moniker or name of this program, I mean, it truly is writing Washington's legacy,
Yeah.
because these individuals are no longer here. This is their legacy.
Well, my mom always said that the best thing about people who were so alive when they were alive is that when they're gone, it's like they're really still here. So I can hear Sid Snyder's voice. I can hear the voice of Dan and Nancy Evans in particular. And what a real privilege that was to be able to spend so much time in Jim Dolliver and Bill Dwyer and John Spellman and Slade Gorton. And
You wanted to talk, too, about Fred Shiosaki.
Fred Shiosaki. It hasn't all been people of celebrity, so to speak, that we've written about, the members of Congress and the judiciary. One of the profiles I'm really proudest of featured Fred Shiosaki. Grew up in Spokane, Japanese immigrant parents, Fred born in America together with his siblings. And with the outbreak of World War II, the Shiosakis, by living inland, were not sent to concentration camps, and let's call them what they were. Not internment camps, they were concentration camps. But Fred, like thousands of other, particularly Nisei, Japanese, American-born Japanese men, joined the United States Army and was a member of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most celebrated, decorated, bravest, most intrepid military units in the history of warfare. They, in their intrepidity, was really personified by an episode in the Vosges Mountains in France and Belgium at the height of the war, when they rescued a battalion, the so-called Lost Battalion, surrounded by German soldiers. And that story, which is featured in the World War II book, became the model for a keep chapter in Daniel James Brown's follow-up to The Boys in the Boat, called Facing the Mountain. Now, Dan's a friend of mine and a great historian, so that was a particularly proud moment.
As we wind down here, what are some stories that haven't been told, or that you wished you had more time to tell, or that you were going to tell your co-historians, you need to finish this, you need to do this, don't forget about so-and-so, or a particular topic or issue?
I think I'd like to collect some of the stories already written and do a latter-day kind of book like Profiles in Courage, like John F. Kennedy did in the Pulitzer Prize-winning book about politicians and others who stood up for their principles. One cast...
So particular chapters from each of these.
From these.
Yeah.
But as for... I regret that we didn't do a full-scale biography with Ralph.
Ralph Monroe, who
yes.
recently passed, former Secretary of State.
My teammate Bob Young, who a brilliant writer who was on 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning teams with the Times, did a really great piece about Ralph that's in our 1968 book. I guess David Ammon's our mutual friend. That would be a really great book about Dave's life. I profiled Dave for our book on marriage equality because Dave trusted me enough to tell his own story, his difficult story of coming out. But Dave has a tremendous book in him.
What about the future of this project and program, especially in light of the budget cuts, in light of the fact you've been the lead here for 17 years, and it's really, you've been the voice and the historian behind it? What happens next?
Well, the Legacy Project transitioned a few years ago to the State Archives. State Archivist Heather Hirataka and her deputy Terry Badger are very supportive of the project, as is Secretary Hobbs. The Legacy Project, there's a couple of slots unfilled right now, including my own, but my understanding is that they're not abandoning, carrying through, keeping this work going. Ian Ed Eckley, who's a first-rate historian, I'm confident that Ed has all the moxie and the talent to carry on. So I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the library. I'm heartsick about it. And a lot of other issues there, but I think Legacy is going to be in good shape.
What do you want your legacy to be? We've talked about your role in the newspaper business. We've talked about your role as a historian for the state. We should note that you've been a mentor to many, many young people through the decades, including 2 reporters who went on to win Pulitzer Prizes, who got their start working for you. You've obviously raised a family. You've remained true to your community, and one that's seen, good times and less good times. But what do you want your legacy to be?
I want my legacy to be a celebration of civic duty and storytelling and how important it is to respect cultural norms, how important it is to maintain our respect for cultural institutions.
Even as times change and even as the world evolves.
I believe these are perilous times for American democracy. I think that I hope my legacy is that I've inspired. There's people out there who've worked for me, work with me, teammates, people I've recruited and nurtured who are carrying on. But these books and these oral histories are a testimony to integrity and democratic values. I think that's, I guess that's
well, and they are your legacy.
They are the legacy is my legacy.
And you've got 17 of them.
Yeah.
Which I want, and so that's my last question. How did you do it? I mean, most people would have retired long ago. Most people would not have been able to produce books at the pace that you did. How did you do this?
Murray was right. When you become an accomplished journeyman deadline reporter, then you can write quickly. The best I ever saw writing quickly there was Ammon's. I could fill another hour with things that I saw him doing on Deadline Pressure, but I just learned to write quickly, and so I guess it's too fertile a brain. I just love storytelling.
Well, John Hughes, thank you for your service to the state.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your retirement. Enjoy this time.
And thank you for what you're doing. TVW is so important to our state and to democracy.
Thank you for that. Good to see you. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We are heading into our summer hiatus. We will be back after Labor Day with a fresh lineup of interviews. Until then, you can catch up on interviews you may have missed at tvw.org. Have a great summer and see you in September.